The following content is for information and entertainment purposes only. The opinions expressed in this episode are those of the participants and do not represent the views of any third-party entities. Go. So Shane, welcome to the Flexibility Focus podcast. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. So for people who might not be familiar with you, could you tell us about you, a bit about your background and how you started your company, GotRom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I kind of started out as a strength and conditioning coach. We were talking just before this podcast about where I've lived, and I studied kinesiology and nutrition in college, and then I moved to Massachusetts, Boston area to do a mentorship with a elite level kind of track and field coach.
Mm-hmm.
He was coaching an Olympic hurdler named Hector, who made it to the 2008 Olympics, 2012 Olympics, I think. And so I kind of grew up in the classical strength and conditioning environment. So I was like, Hector was my training partner. There was some kind of national level strongmen and Olympic weightlifters in the gym in the environment that I grew up in. So classically sort of strength and conditioning coach.
Mm-hmm.
But then where GotRom started was somewhere along the way, I was doing some Olympic weightlifting. I had never given that much importance to stretching or flexibility or mobility work or anything like that. A little bit here, some stretching, some basic foam rolling. But I got injured doing Olympic weightlifting. I have it on my YouTube channel, actually on video. You can see me injure my back.
Wow, okay.
But there's nothing that looks crazy about it. I'm just doing a power clean. It wasn't even that heavy for me. Perfectly neutral spine. Stu McGill would be happy. But what I discovered is that there were some underlying kind of asymmetries that I hadn't fully addressed. And so even though the mechanics were fine, the alignment underneath was not. So that led me on this whole discovery of mobility and yoga and stretching and martial arts and physical therapy and all that stuff. And I kind of morphed from the strength and conditioning coach, personal trainer, to the kind of rehab, mobility, prehab, stretching, flexibility kind of thing, which is what I'm doing now, primarily helping people fix injuries and get flexible.
Cool. I like that. You tend to find as well a lot of people who are involved in this business do have some experience with injury themselves. So no, that's a really interesting point. I'll have to check that video out actually, the clean. But it's an interesting point actually that you mentioned neutral spine, because that's been quite a contentious issue in the last few years. Should we have neutral spine? Shouldn't we? And I don't think it's a case of we should have either neutral or a flex spine. We should be able to tolerate both, because like you've demonstrated, you can get injured doing either.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that's that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I agree on that. I think I wrote a post somewhere on my social media about the myth of neutral spine. And the point is kind of what you were pointing out, is that it's not like we should try to imagine someone going through all sporting activities always with a perfectly neutral spine. Like, it's absurd. Like, try to tumble in gymnastics or throw a baseball or do all kinds of natural, healthy, normal sporting activities in a neutral spine. It's ridiculous. At the same time, as someone who's had several instances in the past of back injuries, it's also safe to say that when someone is rehabbing a back, learning how to move in and out of neutral spine and how to be able to tell if you are in neutral spine or if you're picking something heavy up off the ground, it's often helpful to train that as one of many shapes that you can be in with your spine.
Absolutely.
It's most important that you know the difference between the different positions, not that you always have to be in one stuck frozen position all the time.
Right, absolutely. No, that's a great point. On your social media as well, and in your content, you talk a lot about hip impingement. And I've read through, and it seems like you've had some experience with that yourself. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and maybe tell the audience listening what are some considerations that they should be making if they have an impingement and they want to increase flexibility or mobility?
Yeah. So that power clean where I injured my back was sort of the tipping point that led me to discover that there was some big asymmetries in my hips, led me to find out that I have cam morphology, labral tear, cyst in my right hip. I played soccer most of my life, and then I put fitness on top of that asymmetry before kind of sorting it out.
Mhm.
So that kind of let me find out that I had FAI, kind of morphology. Um, and it led me into the world of mobility work and stretching and flexibility. And once I sort of like got myself more symmetrical, I still have a strangely shaped bone in my right hip, but I've found that you can work around whatever sort of the anatomic genetic deck of cards you've been dealt.
Yeah.
So once I kind of came out of my pain and restored basic symmetrical mobility in my hips, I was like, well, hold on. I'm being told by all these therapists and healers, and my x-ray and my MRI are all saying you've got a bad bone.
Mhm.
You're supposed to not be able to get more range of motion out of that. It's a bony stop. It's a
Mm.
hard
Right.
anatomic stop. But I was like, let's see, let's experiment. I trust my own experience more than I trust any theory, any textbook, anything. I trust what I'm feeling in my own body. And what I was feeling in my own body is, hey, I'm starting to train for the side splits, for the front splits, pancake splits. And I seem to be able to get farther and farther if I do it mindfully and if I take some certain precautions. So if there's people out there that they've been told that they've got something wrong with their anatomy, but they still have a goal to pursue flexibility, the splits for martial arts, for gymnastics, for whatever they're interested in, I do think that you can work towards that. But a couple kind of key important things is one, like respect your limitations. So if there is something funky going on in your hips or some anatomic variant, don't just go to a yoga class and think that you're going to look like the flexible female yoga teacher next to you, because she probably doesn't have your hip structure. So you can get in splits like positions and you can train building strength and building range of motion in those positions, but don't force it. Kind of like have the wisdom to know when you're reaching your limits. And how you'll know that is by tuning into the body sensations, what you're feeling in your body. I think one of the reasons why I have less than ideal hip structures for the hip, for the splits, but one of the reasons that I've been able to get the splits, I think, is because I also concurrently had a mindfulness meditation practice called Vipassana meditation, which is specifically based on body sensations.
Right.
So for 2 hours a day for the past 8 years, I've been tuning into my body sensations during my meditation practice, and then also taking that into my stretching and mobility practices so that my sense of what I'm feeling in my body, my interoception, is very, very high. So I can tell when I'm pushing a boundary that I shouldn't be pushing. So I would encourage anyone who is working towards their splits and maybe has some kind of anatomic funkiness to close their eyes during their stretching and mobility work and feel what they're feeling.
Mhm.
And your body will usually tell you when you're approaching a bad end range. It's not just like a muscle just snaps out of nowhere or strains more likely out of nowhere.
Mhm.
There's warning signs. You feel things.
Yeah.
So go slow, be patient,
Mhm.
be consistent, and be in tune with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I would say for people with maybe FAI morphology or weird anatomic stuff going on that want to also get the splits is I have found that my right hip tightens up quicker. It, like kind of the tightness and the patterns of tightness come back quicker in my right hip than in my left one.
Nice.
So I found that some really targeted tissue work helps to make the stretching then feel more comfortable. So I don't mean foam rolling. Foam rolling is kind of like a basic 101 version of soft tissue work. You can't really foam roll your adductor attachment points. You need a tool that gets in there a little bit more. So if you have your left and right hip and one of them gets tighter quicker, then you can experiment with some deep targeted tissue work before or in conjunction with your stretching, and that might make the stretching feel better for this group of people. Some people can just stretch and they're great and they don't need any kind of tissue work whatsoever, but other people like me found that they needed to chew up the muscle a little bit to kind of get rid of a trigger point or whatever the basis. I mean, not like you can get rid of trigger points, but something happens when you press on the epicenter of painful spots in your muscles, and easy to call them trigger points. That helps my flexibility, and now that I've worked with a lot more people, a lot of people find that the tissue work plus the stretching really helps their type of body.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I had similar issues. I had my hips replaced 5 years ago. Nothing to do with stretching or training. It was because when I was in the army, I got injured, and everything was put back in the right place. And I was told by the surgeon, if you stretch, you'll be able to have normal range of motion. Every stretching technique that I tried, I was having no results with, and then decided to do some self-applied soft tissue work, literally just jamming the thumbs into what you'd call trigger points. I mean, we'll not go down the whole rabbit hole of what are trigger points, and can we do a sore spot basically. And we know that if, like, when we stub our toes and we hold it, that kind of mechanical force that we get from touch overrides the pain sensations, and that helped me get deeper and deeper into the splits. And even with hip replacements now, I can still do the full splits. It takes longer than I used to, but like you say, some people do need that soft tissue intervention. And I always say hands are far better than any piece of plastic or piece of PVC or rubber that you could get, because we've got so many nerve endings in our fingers. We get that kind of double feedback, both from the limb that we're pressing into and from our hands as well. That's a really, really valid point.
Yeah. I think in that journey that I was describing of me coming out of my hip impingement, one of the best things that I did was to find a very, very skilled manual therapist, not just any old massage from any old person, but someone who I would consider like a master at their craft.
Yeah.
And he did very, very deep, sustained, targeted soft tissue work with his elbows, thumbs, knees, shins, and some tools that he kind of had. But the difference between him and anyone else that I'd ever had do body work on me, which is a lot of people, is from the minute I laid down on his table until 60 to 90 minutes later, he was working on what felt like the epicenter of the problem. Like sometimes, usually when you go get a massage, like people are like kind of massaging a little bit everywhere. Every once in a while they hit like that spot and you're like, ooh, like that's the spot, but then they're off it again and they're off in some other area. Whereas with him, because he had his own mindfulness practice, he also had a practice where he would work on his own body for hours and hours. He was a craftsman. He was a practitioner. He did the work on himself. He didn't just read a textbook and then follow his basic massage flow that he did on every single one of his clients. And that human touch, his hands, plus the fact that he had put in many, many hours, opened my eyes up to what was available out of soft tissue work. It's not just massage. It's not just a little bit of foam rolling on the quads. It can go so much deeper. Just like stretching is not just static stretching, just like strength training is not just bicep curls. Like each one of those categories goes way, 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 way deep. But often people are saying like, oh, stretching doesn't work, because they're talking about one version of static stretching that they studied in some studies, or they say massage doesn't do anything because they're talking about generic kind of like surface level massage or 1 minute on each quad foam rolling. And so it's kind of, we have to be very specific with what we mean when we say stretching, what we mean when we say soft tissue work and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Before we move on to the next question, can you just tell us how to spell that mindfulness practice that you mentioned?
Sure. Yeah,
just in case people want to Google it, that's all.
It's Vipassana, Vipassana, Vipassana. And the website of the specific practice that I practice is dhamma.org, DHAMMA.org, with Essen Goenka, who's deceased, but he does these, getting more and more famous every day, kind of 10-day retreats, which are completely free. You don't pay anything for them. They're all donation based. You go there, they feed you, they teach you the technique, you practice it. It's like mindfulness of breathing plus mindfulness of body sensations.
Yeah.
So it's a very kind of like body based meditation. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So what are some of the myths surrounding stretching and mobility training that you particularly dislike?
So many. I bet you've got like chapters in your book to this.
Yeah.
Myths of stretching. Well, one of them, which I never thought I would kind of have to be counteracting, but a lot of people actually come to me thinking that flexibility solves everything. So they think that more range of motion equals more health. Like if they can just get farther into the splits, they're going to feel better, which is it kind of makes a certain amount of sense. Like you see a picture of someone doing the splits and you're like, wow, they're like bamboo. They can bend, they can move. They must feel so great, but not necessarily. Like you need enough range of motion
Mhm.
to do the movements of your daily life or your sport without compensating, and
Yeah.
you don't need more range of motion than that for health.
Mm.
So I think that's probably one of the biggest ones, that flexibility equals health.
Mhm.
Now on the other side of the spectrum, if you don't have enough range of motion, say you need to do stuff in the gym or in your life where you need to pick something up off the floor. If you don't have the range of motion or mobility or motor control or all the combination of all of those things to do that without compensating at your low back, you could hurt yourself. And that goes for any other pattern or movement. If you need to reach up above yourself and you don't have that adequate shoulder range of motion and you compensate, especially if it's under speed or load or something like that, then you might get hurt. So flexibility does not equal health, but a lack of flexibility might hurt you in some situations.
Yeah, yeah, cool. You kind of answered my next question as well, because I was going to ask you, like, flexibility or mobility training is kind of seen as a panacea by some therapists and trainers who their answer to every question is get more range of motion, and that's obviously not the case. So you've done 2 for 1 there.
Well, I can speak a little bit more on that because it also ties back into the femoral acetabular impingement, the hip impingement, FAI kind of conversation, because I've noticed over time, because that's a group of people that I work a lot with, people with hip impingement, and I've noticed that there's kind of like 2 large categories. There's people that were more like me, like the weightlifter, they had a little bit more muscle mass on them, lack of joint mobility, a lack of range of motion, and those people often need and respond to more kind of tissue work and stretching, more kind of getting things moving better and more. But then there's also this other category of people which they're already hypermobile. Maybe they haven't done any strength training in years or ever. This kind of you could call it like the hyper flexible female yogi, for example. They've got hypermobile joints and they have hip impingement, the same problem that I have, but it's not because they're lacking mobility. It's more they're lacking stability or motor control, some combination of kind of like being able to control things better. So making them stretch more just doesn't make any sense. They often don't even need the tissue work. What they need to do is to deadlift. They need to do some Romanian deadlifts. They need to learn how to stabilize their core in space. I remember a stark example that I saw this one time where there was this kind of like renowned, I don't know, she was relatively a famous yoga teacher in California. And she came into the gym that I was working at, and we were doing like a trade or something, because I like to kind of trade with people and learn their thinking, their system, their exercises. So she was teaching me some yoga stuff. I was teaching her some strengthening stuff. And I asked her to do an overhead squat with a fairly light bar, and she couldn't get past parallel. Now she could fall into the splits very easily, but because she didn't know how to position her core and her pelvis in space, she was running into her hips before she even got to depth. So if you didn't know why she couldn't get to depth, you might say, oh, she's not flexible enough, but she clearly was. She just didn't have the motor control and the stability to express her joints range of motion as well as she could. So those are kind of like the 2 types of people that I see in hip impingement, to speak kind of generally.
Very good, very good. You touched briefly on soft tissue tools like foam rollers. What are your thoughts specifically on foam rollers, massage guns, the peanuts that people use? Because we see a lot of they're gaining more and more popularity. What are your thoughts on those?
They're tools. They
Mm-hmm.
can be used in a skillful way, or they can be used excessively and as a panacea to fix everything. So on one end of the spectrum, you have people that are like, foam rolling's the greatest, and I'm going to foam roll for 30 minutes and then jump into a heavy squat. And if they forgot about the classic kind of principles of training, like get hot and sweaty, warm up, get your nervous system activated, and often your mobility automatically improves and stuff like that. So they can be overused on one end of the spectrum, and people can, buy every massage Theragun under the sun and every mobility tool under the sun, and they forget to like warm up and work on their deadlifting and squat technique. And that's the pendulum swinging too far in one direction. On the other side of the spectrum, there's people that because they've never had to kind of calm muscles down to be able to do a proper squat. They're like, just squat, and that improves your range of motion. Like if you just do the classical squatting and deadlifting and lunging, that's all you ever need. And for some people, they'll be right. Like for some people, that's all they need because they don't have a funky, weird hip or something that needs a little bit of extra tender loving care for it to be able to move like a joint should. So it always depends on the context. It always depends on the person in front of you. Some people, because of their joint structures, because of their body types, because of their training, they just need to like do these 5 kind of classic gym strength training exercises and they're good to go. And that's totally legit. You shouldn't have to do, I'm all about like the minimalist training, like do only the exercises that give you the most bang for your buck and give you the results that you want. And anything extra is just fluff and unnecessary. But don't assume that everyone is exactly like you, because some people will need to do a little bit of extra supplementary training. It kind of reminds me of like the classic bodybuilding thing where some bodybuilders are like, you just need to squat, deadlift, pull-ups, bench, boom. Do that, increase intensity over time, and you're good. And that might work for a lot of people, but some people have lagging muscles and they need to do a little bit of isolation work to bring up those lagging muscles. That doesn't mean that their bicep curls should replace heavy pull-ups, but they might need a little bit of supplementary work. So it's a spectrum, and it depends on the individual.
Yeah, absolutely. You just mentioned my favorite quote, actually, which I get called out for quite a bit when somebody asks me a question and you go to answer is, it depends. You'll have some doctors or whatever on social media saying, oh, if you find a practitioner or a coach or therapist who says it depends, that's a sign that they don't know what they're talking about, when actually really I think that's the sign of somebody who's quite experienced and well versed in human movement and training, because it, like you say, it does depend. That's a great answer. If someone came to you and they said, I only have enough time in the day to do one stretch, what's the exercise that you would give them?
First, I would need to know what their goal is. Like I can only do one stretch and I want to get the middle splits. Then I would say you should do gradually increasing intensity, isometric kind of middle splits with some contracting, relaxing, some holding your end ranges, some building some strength and endurance. If it's like just for overall health, I don't know. That's a hard one. Like maybe like a squat hang combo, or like squatting with some active shoulder reaching or something like that. So you get a little bit of lower body, a little bit of upper body. So it kind of depends on their goal. Is it posture? I would say maybe do versions of a back bridge or something like that. So it depends.
I thought you were going to say that. Oh, brilliant. Looking on your website, you have an incredible number of testimonials from satisfied clients from all over the world. For other trainers who are watching this or listening to it on the podcast, what's one piece of advice that you could give to them to improve their customer satisfaction and engagement?
It's a couple of things. One is, I think, just being the real deal. Like don't regurgitate information that you read or saw somewhere. Like be a practitioner, do the work. If you're teaching people about how to do the splits and be flexible, you should be able to do that stuff. So kind of there's a book I think written by Cal Newport called So Good They Can't Ignore You. So like I think this is forgotten in kind of our social media, Instagram world, because anyone can jump online and start teaching, often without having 18 years of experience doing it, like yourself. So there's a risk that people try to start teaching before they've really mastered their craft, and they might find that people aren't getting results from their methodology, so they don't want to give them reviews. They're reluctant to do so because the results aren't kind of there. And I see this in the meditation world too, where meditation's gotten popular, and people that have never really meditated that deeply are now meditation teachers because they've got a nice, relaxing sounding voice. And so now they're a meditation teacher. So I think if you're a trainer or a coach, the first thing to do is become so good that they can't ignore you, become the real deal, where you actually just know your stuff. Like, I don't need to recite what I read about hip impingement from a textbook because I lived through it. Like, I can just speak from my direct personal experience over many years now. You don't have to, like, you can just say your experience to people about flexibility training because you've been doing it for so many years. So be the real deal is one. I think care, like, a lot of people want to just bring in the money from their social media or their programs or their whatever, their certifications. But they don't actually care about the people on the receiving end of whatever they're giving. They just they care more about the money. So they're not answering the comments, they're not answering the DMs, they're not answering the emails at all hours of the week and or night. And they don't go that extra mile for the actual human beings that are on the other side of your teaching. And I think that if you want a bunch of reviews or high quality reviews, then you need to serve people in a extraordinary kind of way, like go above and beyond to help them get the results that they want.
Yeah. You remind me of a quote I heard in the last week or so. I can't remember if it was Adam Meekins or Greg LeMond on one of their podcasts, but they said that 90% of what trainers or therapists do is connection, and unless you care and you're willing to actually connect with someone on a human level, then you've already lost the battle, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really good advice.
Yeah.
The fun question, if you were stranded on a desert island and you could only take one book, one piece of gym equipment, and one type of food or drink, what would you take?
Stranded on a desert island. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind for what book I would bring is a collection of books, and it's pretty hefty. It's actually the Tipitaka, which probably sounds like a strange answer, but it's basically the collected teachings of the Buddha on how to be happy, how to live a good life, how to meditate. But that's like, I could fill like a wall behind me with all those. So if I had to boil it down to one book, there's a book called The Noble Eightfold Path by Bhikkhu Bodhi. He's a monk, and he writes in a very concise way. He takes all the Buddhist teachings on meditation and how to live a happy life and boils it down into this really simple little book. So if I was stuck on an island, I would probably want the teachings of the Buddha, probably more than like super training or science and practice of strength training or something.
Yeah, I think you'd be burning those soon. Before long, I need some firewood, get it on there.
And what else? A piece of gym equipment. Having traveled around the world a little bit, I think the most useful thing that I always feel like I'm missing if I don't have it is like a set of like rings or handles that I can hang from and do pull-ups and rows and stuff like that. Because you can always do like squats and lunges and push-ups without any equipment, and you can run and jump and do plyometrics and stretch. But the one thing that's harder to do is always the pulling motion. Like I've like found some chairs and I'm trying to like do rows with some chairs, or my wife's like hands or something. But so I think a pair of pull-up rings I would bring, and then a food would have to be Indian food. I'm a huge fan of some good, spicy, creamy Indian food.
I like that. Very good. Before we finish, can you just tell people how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, gotram.com is my main website. If you have hip impingement, then thefaifix.com. FAI is femoral acetabular impingement, thefaifix.com, or just Google me. I'm pretty easy to find.
Yeah. I just need to correct as well. In one of the previous episodes, obviously featured you in the spotlight segment of one of the main episodes, and I think I said your Instagram handle was just Gotrom, but it's the Gotrom.
Yeah.
So just if people are trying to find you on Instagram, it's the Gotrom. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Shane, that was a brilliant conversation. Very enlightening. I really enjoyed that. So thank you for your answers, and thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, buddy. See you later.
See ya.
All right.